In this video, I'm going to be showing you why remote functions are unsafe to use and how to make a replacement. I'm also going to be showing you how to use a module that I've created in the toolbox. So if we go to the invoke client method, here we can see that Roblox has given us a warning. And the warning that we need to take note of is this last warning over here. And it says that if the client doesn't return a value, the server yields forever. So what I've done is created a baseplate project, and I've created two scripts, a server script and a client script, and a remote function. Here we can see the server script, and here we can see the client script. So simply what we're doing, every heartbeat, we're using the remote function to invoke to the client the message of hello, and then the client returns the message of bye. So up to this point, there is no problem. But as we know, exploiters have the ability to change their local scripts. So what would happen if an exploiter decided to set the onClientInvoke function to nil? Or if the exploiter decides to add a task.wait and wait for a very long time within this function? Well, this will cause the invoke client method on the server side to yield forever. And this is bad because now we're going to get a memory leak because this thread is going to be waiting forever. So the way we can see this is if I go to the top of the script and type in debug, set memory category, and I give it the name of test. And now in game, I can press F9. I can go to memory. I can go to server, and here I can search for test. And here we can see the test. And what we should notice is that the memory for test keeps going up and up and up forever, because now we have a memory leak. So let's now create a custom remote function that does not have a memory leak. So to do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace the remote function with a remote event. And then I'm going to get this remote event inside of our scripts, like this. And I'm going to do the same on the client side. So the way this is going to work is we're going to use this remote event to send a message to the client, and then the client is going to use the same remote event to send a message back to us. But while we're waiting for the response, we're going to yield on the server side. But what we're going to do differently is we're going to have a timeout so that if the client does not respond within a certain period of time, we're going to cancel the thread and no longer wait for a response. So to get started, the first thing I'm going to do is create a custom invoke client function. So over here, I'm going to say local function invoke client, and we're going to take in the player and a list of arguments. And now, instead of calling the remote functions invoke client, we're going to call our custom function. So let's do this like this. And inside of this function, I want to store the thread that's going to be yielding so I know which thread to resume after a certain amount of time or when the client responds. So at the top, I'm going to create a variable called threads. It's going to be a table. And when we call invoke client, I'm going to get the current thread by saying local thread equals quarantine running. And then I'm going to add this thread to the front of the table. And then when it gets removed, we're going to remove from the back of the table. So threads are going to get placed in the front, and then they're going to get removed from the back. Another thing we're going to do is we're going to have a table for each individual player, because when we remove from the back, I want to make sure I remove a thread from the same player, not from a different player. So what we're going to do is I'm going to create a variable called player threads equals, and we're going to use this threads table, and we can use the player as the key to find this player's threads. Now, if this player does not have any threads, this variable is going to be equal to nil. So we need to create a new table to store this player's threads. So to do this, I'm going to say if player threads equals nil, then I'm going to say player threads equals table. And then I'm also going to add this table into the threads table. So I'm going to say threads with the player key equals player threads, end. Okay, so now we need to store this thread that we're going to yield until we get a response inside of the player threads table, but we also need to save a timeout thread that's going to cancel this yield if the client does not return. So to do this, I'm going to create a new function and I'm going to call it timeout. And this function is going to simply receive the player which timed out. And to create our timeout thread, all we're going to do is say local timeout thread equals task.delay. And we're going to set a delay of any amount we want, but I'm going to use 5 seconds. So if the client does not respond in 5 seconds, this yielding thread will stop yielding. And I'm going to pass in the timeout function. And then I'm also going to pass the player as a parameter to this function. And now I'm going to create another table. So I'm going to say local, and I'm going to call this table invoke data. And inside of this table, I'm going to place these two threads. So I'm going to say invoke data dot yielding thread equals, and I'm going to store this thread over here, but we don't have to store the variable here. We could just pass this in directly and remove this variable altogether. And the next value we want to store in this table is timeout thread. And just like the other thread, we can just pass this in directly like this, and now we can get rid of this variable over here. So now I've created a table, and we have two threads stored in this table, which is going to be added to the front of the player threads table. So to do this, I'm going to say table.insert, and we're going to insert into the player threads, and we're going to insert at index 1, which is the front, and we're going to insert the invoke data table. And now we're going to fire the remote event. So I'm going to say remote event fire client. I'm going to use the player that we passed into the function, and then I'm going to pass whatever parameters we passed into the function into this function as well, like so. And finally, I'm now going to yield this yielding thread, which was the current running thread. So to do this, I'm going to say quarantine.yield, and we're going to pass in the yielding thread. And whatever parameters this yielding thread returns, we want to return back to whoever called this function over here. So I'm going to add a return to the front of this yield, like so. Okay, so now that we've finished our invoke client function, let's complete our timeout function. So the first thing we're going to do inside of this function is we're going to use the player object to get the player threads. So I can just simply copy and paste this over here. But one thing we don't need to do, we don't need to check if it's equal to nil, because this timeout function will only ever be called while there is at least one thread inside of the player threads table. And now let's use table remove on this table to extract the invoke data that's at the end of this table. So to do this, I'm going to say local invoke data equals table.remove, and we're going to pass in the player threads. And if we don't pass in a position, it will automatically get the thread, the invoke data from the end of this table. Now what I'm going to do now is check, after we've removed the invoke data from the player threads, if there are no more threads remaining inside of this table, I want to remove this table from the threads table so that there is no data lingering around and we don't get any memory leaks. So to do this, I'm going to say if player threads is equal to 0, which means there's no more threads remaining, then threads of the key of player equals nil. And finally, what we want to do now is resume this yielding thread. So to do this, I'm going to say quarantine dot resume, and I'm going to pass in the yielding thread from the invoked data. Now, if we wanted to, we could pass in any value to this yield and it will get returned back to this function. But I just want to return nil, so I'm not going to return any other values. And now we've finished our timeout function. And so what we need to do now is use the remote event to detect when the client responds to one of our events. So over here, I'm going to say remote event dot on server event, and I'm going to connect a function to this event. And this function is going to tell us the player, and it's also going to tell us whatever values the player has sent to us. Now this function is going to work a lot like timeout, but not 100% the same. So firstly, we want to get the player threads. Now ideally, this will never be nil, but we can't trust the client because an exploiter may send many events when we did not request events. So we do need to check to make sure that player threads is not equal to nil. So what I'm going to say is if player threads is equal to nil, then return. So we're just going to return and do nothing. And so the next thing we want to do is get the invoked data, and we're going to do this the exact same as how we did it over here. Now we don't have to worry about this ever being nil, because remember, if player threads had no results, we remove it from the threads table. So there's no way that this can ever be nil, because if the player threads table exists, there's always going to be at least one invoked data within that table. And the next thing I want to do is the same thing that we did here. If there's no more threads in the player threads, then I want to remove it from the threads table. So I'm just going to copy and paste this over here like this. And the next thing we're going to do is we want to cancel this timeout thread so this timeout function doesn't get called, because now we've got a response from the client. So to do this, I'm going to say task.cancel, and I'm going to pass in the timeout thread from within the invoked data table. And finally, we want to do the same that we did here with timeout. We want to resume the yielding thread. But what we want to do different is we want to pass whatever values the client sent to us to this function so they can see what the client said. So over here, I'm going to add 3 dots. Like so. So let's now change the client side to work with our remote event. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to detect when the server sends a event. Like so. And then all we're going to do is respond with the fire server, and we're going to say whatever we want to say back to the server. Now we can delete this, and we've now finished the client side. So that we can see that this script works, what I'm going to do, I'm going to comment out this run service, and I'm just going to call the invoke client once, and I'm going to pass in the player, and I'm going to pass in the message of hello. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to save the response into a variable, and then I'm going to print the response. I'm going to say client and print the response like this. So we should see that it says client and the response should be bye. And here we can see it says client with the response of bye. Now, because we have a timeout of 5 seconds, if the client does a task.wait and waits for 2 seconds, we should still get our response. But if the client does a task wait greater than 5 seconds, for instance 6 seconds, and if we now play the game, we should notice that the response is now nil because the response is going to time out. So if we wait here and check our output, we can see client nil. So what this means is we should no longer be able to get a memory leak. So let's bring back the run service and let's delete this at the bottom over here. And over here, instead of waiting for 6 seconds, let's wait for a very long time like we did before. So if I press F9, go back into memory and then server and search for test. And here we should see that the memory goes up, but after a certain period of time, it should flatten off and we no longer have a memory leak. Now, if you guys don't want to script your own custom functions, what you can do is use my module that I've created and shared in the toolbox. So let's go to the toolbox. And under models, I'm going to search for Suphi. And here we should see Suphi's remote function module. And make sure it's from my username, which is 5UPHI. And I'm going to click, and this is going to pop up. I'm going to press OK. And now we should have my module inside of Workspace. Inside of my module, you will find 2 example scripts, and you can use them scripts to work out how to use the module. But I'm going to simply delete these 2 example scripts for now. And I'm going to move this module into replicated storage. And I'm going to delete the remote event, and I'm going to rename the module to remote function. And now what I'm going to do is delete everything from the server script, but I'm just going to keep the player object. And on the client side, I'm going to delete everything. And now I'm going to require this remote function module. So to do this, I'm going to say local remote function equals require game.replicate storage remote function. And I'm going to do the same on the client side. So now we should have something that looks like this. The next thing I'm going to do is use the remote function module to create a remote function. So to do this, I'm going to say local test remote function equals remote function dot new. Now this takes in 2 variables or 1 variable. And the first variable that is required is the name. I'm just going to call this remote function a test. And I'm also going to do the same on the client side. So we've created a test remote function for both the server and client. So let's now use this test remote function to fire an event to the client. So to do this, I'm going to simply say test remote function. I'm going to use the fire method. And first we're going to pass in the player we want to fire the event to, and then we want to send the message. So I'm just going to say hello. And now we need to receive this message on the client side. So to do this, I'm going to say test remote function dot event equals function. And this is going to receive the message. And we can print this message. And then I'm going to return bye. And over here, we're going to receive this response. So let's save the response. Local response equals this. And then I'm going to print the response like so. And if we now test the game, we can see that the client received the message of hello and the server got the response of bye. There's also an alternative method of connecting this function to this event. And the way we can do that is simply we can remove this variable and we can connect it directly inside of the new function. So if I do this and do this, now this function will directly be connected to this remote functions event. And if we want to, we can also do this in the opposite direction. So the client can request a response from the server. So to do this, I'm going to store the variable once again. And then on the client side, I'm going to fire the fire event, and I'm going to pass in whatever information I want to send to the server. So let's just say hello server. And now the server must receive this event. Now we can connect a function to this the same way we did here, directly inside of the new constructor, or we could just use the event like we did at the start, like this. Now this is going to tell us which player sent the message and also the message, which is going to be hello server. And then we can respond by simply returning the response, like so. Another difference between my remote functions module and Roblox's built-in remote functions is if you return the value of nil, then no remote event is going to be fired back to the client and the client is going to time out. And the same is true the other way around. If the client returns the value of nil, no message is going to be sent back and the server will time out. The reason for this is, let's assume an exploiter keeps sending us messages. Now, if we detect that this is an exploiter, we can simply return nil, and now we won't waste valuable data sending information back to exploiters, and they just keep timing out over and over again. Thank you for watching my video, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below.